The brain is a thing that you're sure you have.
Brilliant reply.
In the 1960s and 70s, scientist and mathematician Dr. Bronowski was Britain's favourite telly-don.
He made you think. That was the thing. Deeply, nothing superficial.
Good evening. The most remarkable man that I ever listened to was Einstein.
He made being clever look easy.
He was a rational human being.
No cutting, no untying the knots. Get yourself disentangled and I'll come back to you later on.
He did fundamental research.
Some of these papers are touching on bits of mathematics which were novel.
My name is Lisa Jardine, and I'm Jacob Bronowski's eldest daughter.
You see, common sense is always being recreated in the world.
This is absolutely the father I remember. My father argued that science was a force for good in the world. He died more than 35 years ago, but recently I made a disturbing discovery about the science that he did. During the Second World War, he used his mathematical brilliance to maximize the destructive force of aerial bombardment. Were people wrong about Jacob Bronowski? Was I?
Physics in the 20th century is an immortal work.
In search of answers, I'm turning detective, investigating my own father. In 1973, the BBC broadcast a 13-part television series called The Ascent of Man. This epic history of science and civilization was written and presented by my father, the scientist Jacob Bronowski.
This is the old University of Vienna. This is Machu Picchu. Here I am in this marvelous colored landscape of Greece.
The programs present the story of mankind as one of unfaltering progress, for which Bruno, as I've always called him, gives all the credit to science.
These programs or essays are a journey through intellectual history, a personal journey to the high points of man's achievement, what the poet Yeats called monuments of unaging intellect.
The heroic scale of The Ascent of Man and Bruno's commanding screen presence were uplifting. The series persuaded viewers that science was unequivocally a force for good in the world. Bruno seemed evangelical about this. One TV critic described him as fervent to the point of passion.
I am at the navel of the world.
The Ascent of Man made my father a celebrity.
I enjoy everything. I don't have to hide from you the fact that I would be enjoying this conversation even if you're a pretty girl.
The 13th and final episode of The Ascent of Man was set in the modernist house my parents built for themselves in the 1960s, high on a cliff top in Southern California.
It's something of a shock to think that justice is part of the biological equipment of man.
Bruno brought the cameras into his home because he wanted to reduce the vast sweep of civilization to the scale of his own life story.
And that's taught me since then that a man's life, a man's home, is a proper place in which to study his biological uniqueness.
But our home also housed a secret, and though Bruno died almost 40 years ago, I have only just discovered the truth for myself. It was late last year when I stumbled into the mystery that rocked my understanding of who my father was. I was in California on a visit to my parents' home. I was coming here to care for my mother, whose health was failing. And I wanted to take a long look inside a walk-in cupboard which I knew to contain private papers of my father's. I took the key to this cupboard, which is a sort of talisman from my teenage years, a cupboard I was never allowed into. It had a silent alarm. And what I found there were 2 boxes, 2 crystallized fruit boxes. My father loved crystallized fruits, in which was stacked his diaries from the 1920s to the day he died. Alongside them was a pile of typed papers. And these, when I looked at them, were all labeled top secret, confidential, Department of Home Security. And so that night I sat in the living room here with my mother sleeping and began to go through the diaries alongside the papers. And they opened up for me a whole part of my father's life of which I had not had the slightest inkling. The documents are research papers written by Bruno during the Second World War. They reveal that his wartime work was crucial to the RAF bombing campaign against German cities. Back in London, I reread my father's papers. I'm a historian. It's my job to look into the archives of other people's lives. But when I saw these documents, they provoked more than professional curiosity. The theory of primary fire raising with small incendiary bombs by Dr. R.B. Fisher and Dr. J. Bronowski. I was completely taken aback by them. They were about how to drop bombs from planes in what array, from what height, with what scatter. Standardized casualty rates per ton of blast bombs. And for the angles of strike considered, the masking of the zone of vulnerability by the site 1, the mean area of the individual fire divisions into which the building, the possibility of starting firestorms by bombardment, the damage to civilian housing as well as to factories and installations, and ultimately the annihilation of the enemy. Probabilities of events of the nature of these types of spread of fire were clearly dependent, allowing for overhitting. 75 tons of large blast bombs per square mile would then give 1,500 killed, 2,000 seriously injured, and 4,000. I honour my parents' generation, and I know there was no moral equivalence between the Allied bombing campaign and the atrocities of the Holocaust. But since that night in California, a gap has opened up in my father's life story as I know it. He used mathematics to work out how best to kill people, then devoted the rest of his life to promoting the wonders of science.
The ascent of man is always teaching in the balance. There's always a sense of uncertainty as to whether, when man lifts his foot for the next step, it's really going to come down ahead. And what is ahead of us? At last, the bringing together of all that we've learned in physics and in biology towards an understanding of where we have come, what man is.
Bruno was not a man who did one thing then said another. Once I found his papers, I badly needed to fit them into my understanding of him. I wanted to find out how he had felt moving through the shadow of World War II to his exuberant, ebullient optimism about where science was taking us. I start my investigation in London's East End. Jacob Bronowski came here aged 12, having fled across Central Europe along with millions of other Jews suffering oppression and discrimination there. His parents brought not much more with them than the clothes they stood up in, and Bruno spoke only 2 words of English. He came to this local library to study because it had the books he couldn't afford to buy. Education, specifically maths and science, gave my father hope of a better future. Bruno was a maths prodigy. Within 7 years of arriving in England, he won a scholarship to the University of Cambridge. So this is wonderful. The college first-year photograph. And in the very, very middle of the front row, seated, trying to look tremendously grown up, is a very small, extraordinarily foreign-looking young man, and that's my father. This photo brings home to me how out of place my father must have felt at Cambridge. His old college has some letters Bruno wrote at this time, which reveal his youthful reaction to his first brush with the British establishment. Dear Bill, there are 5,000 undergraduates in Cambridge. 4,500 wear +4s, eat 3-course breakfasts and go to flicks. Dullness has here found an infinity of disguises. What a hole. These letters showed me a side of him I'd never seen before. Cocky, adversarial, slightly smilingly pushy. Bruno spent 6 years at Cambridge. He got a first-class degree and a doctorate in mathematics. Cambridge opened the door to his wider intellectual life. He edited a poetry magazine and began a book on the poet-artist William Blake. The young boffin was en route to becoming the man who could talk about anything.
It's almost exactly what Aristotle said about great tragedies. Yes.
Of course, history didn't stand still between the nomad and the Renaissance. What I got when I first came to England, the sense of pleasure in the companionship of civilized minds.
Bruno did not set out to become a public intellectual. His journey onto the airwaves was dogged by setback and accident. He failed to secure an academic post at Cambridge. So in 1934, now Dr. Bronowski, he got a job as a lecturer in mathematics at the new University of Hull. He was settling down to a quiet life as a provincial academic. 5 years later, war broke out.
The great curtain of secrecy is still drawn as invasion troops embark, and our Prime Minister makes a last-minute visit to the assembled armada.
The Second World War was not just a conflict of men and bullets. It was fought with technology and science. In 1943, Bruno left Hull and joined the Department of Home Security, which was then pioneering the military application of maths, what's known as operations research. The mathematical papers I found in my father's locked cupboard were written for operations research. Several contained technical calculations for the RAF strategic bombing campaign against the cities of Germany. In one raid in 1945 against Dresden, as many as 40,000 people were engulfed in the firestorm the saturation bombing created. My father never spoke to me about operations research. I have to use my skills as a historian to work out what doing this scientific work meant to him. In the locked room at the family home, I also found his diaries running from the 1920s down to his death in 1974. The appointments diary really chillingly runs out. He crosses things out as they happen, and where the crossings out end, he died of a heart attack. And my mother's tears are still on that page. My mother, Rita, was a sculptor who also came from the Jewish community in London's East End. She married my father in 1941. It was a couple of years later that Bruno joined operations research. Well, there's a very important meeting with Sir George Thompson, Professor Ellis and Blackett on the 17th of March. That is definitely to do with operational research. But these are only appointments diaries, vital for telling me where he was when, but giving away nothing about how he felt. So I'm going to meet a leading mathematician with expertise in the civilian descendant of operations research, applying statistics to real-life problems. I've already sent Frank Kelly my father's wartime papers. I suppose my first response was to be quite taken aback by the extent to which they were involved with the nitty-gritty of making bombing more effective. But perhaps you could tell me a bit more about the mathematics of them.
The military operations, in order to make them most effective, often requires quite a large-scale analysis of the numbers, the probability that bombs will be effective in this or that area, where best to allocate them. So if you look at the mathematics that's involved in the papers here that your father was involved in, there are parts of statistics. There's calculations of probability of how far an incendiary bomb's effects would be felt in built-up areas. And then there's analytical calculations of, for example, the impact of a bomb in a cutting rather than in open space. I mean, they're difficult problems to solve. There could only be relatively few people that could attack the kinds of problems that are being dealt with.
I suppose because I do know my father's voice so well, I can hear the points at which he kind of lights up mathematically.
It is interesting. I mean, some of these papers are touching on bits of mathematics which were novel. It wasn't just application of existing techniques, it was actually new material. Now that's inherently and naturally fun. So this one here, how to trade off the height at which the plane releases the bomb. If it's higher, it's less accurate in 2 dimensions, but it penetrates further.
So you see, you're enjoying this. This is clearly the kind of thing you're enjoying, even though you're talking about maximum penetration brackets and then, you know, the inhabitants of the...
Actually, I have to say, I hadn't thought of it. I mean, I know we use these words, but I hadn't thought of it in that context of the war. I thought of it more as like a video game.
From Frank Kelly, I learn how a mathematician can become immersed in the mathematical elegance of the kind of research Bruno did in the war. And his success in operations research certainly helped his career. I'm taken aback by this unknown chapter in my father's life. The one thing I do not get out of any of this, and I think that has surprised me, is any sense of moral wobble. Joining operations research was not the only life change for Bruno during the Second World War. The 10th of April, Rita to hospital. Girl born 11 a.m. Wednesday, the 12th of April, 1944. It says, girl born. 13th, see Rita and child. That's me. It's a funny idea, isn't it?
I remember as a young father tiptoeing to the cradle of my first daughter when she was 4 or 5 days old and thinking, these marvelous fingers, every joint so perfect. The fingernails, I couldn't have designed that in a million years.
But I was barely toddling, and my sister Judith a babe in arms when Bruno was sent overseas. Germany surrendered in May 1945. A month later, my father flew across the Atlantic for secret talks with Britain's American allies, who were now intensifying their bombing raids against Japan. And he's in Washington, and actually goes to Baltimore, Philadelphia, Trenton, Princeton, but he's moving around to New York. He goes to San Francisco, Reno, Salt Lake City, Denver, Omaha, Iowa, Chicago, Washington. I knew absolutely nothing of this until I saw this diary. So he is really at the heart of the events As a scientist and mathematician, he is at the heart of the events. Bruno's status in operations research was rising, but the strategic bombing campaign that he was helping to plan against Japan was about to be overtaken by events. At 8:15 on the 6th of August 1945, the US Air Force dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima in Japan. It was called Little Boy and killed around 40,000 people. 3 days later, an even more powerful atomic bomb, known as Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 70,000 Japanese. Days later, the Japanese surrendered, ending the Second World War. I've gone meticulously through his letters, his diaries, the papers he was writing at this point for the Department of Home Security. There is no evidence, not a shred there, that he is aware of the imminent dropping of the atomic bomb. However, the Department of Home Security was commissioned to produce the post-mortem report on the bombing of Japan. So in late 1945, Bruno was off on his travels again. He joined a small hand-picked team who arrived in Japan just 2 months after the atomic bombs exploded there. Their task was to report on how Western-style buildings had stood up to the blasts. I'm on my way to meet Francis Wally, who was with my father in Japan.
This is the one I think of.
Report of the British mission to Japan.
Well, there you are. And there I am.
As a young man, Francis Wally was a keen amateur photographer. He took pictures of Japan in the aftermath of the atomic bomb. Most of them I've never seen.
You'll find him in here somewhere.
There he is!
Yeah. Oh, well, that's the other one, I think.
Oh, that's a fantastic picture. The research team of which Francis Wally and Bruno were part was collecting information that would supposedly help Britain protect itself against a possible nuclear attack. But what Bruno and Francis Wally found was devastation beyond their wildest dreams. Oh my goodness, so that's Ground Zero.
Yes, at Nagasaki.
That was a city. Just absolutely everything gone. In how many seconds?
One.
Bruno spent 6 weeks in Japan. It seems to have affected him in a profound way, one that coloured the rest of his life. He never spoke to me, so I'm gleaning it from the papers and the letters and the diaries. I think it was twice over important for him. It was the first time he had held a job for which he was seriously respected. He was the senior mathematician. The second thing was the intensity of the experience, seeing abject misery all around him in Japan and the enormity of what has happened. Although briefed to look at steel and concrete, the diaries record the fact that Bruno also visited hospitals where he encountered casualties of the bomb. I do find it striking that on several occasions in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, my father feels the need or chose to join a group to go to a hospital and see the casualties. Medical lecture from Majors Tarnower and Berg. Population and casualty statistics, visit Soa Jimsha Shrine. Drive to villages. He did care about, I think, am I allowed to feel out of these entries that he cared about what had happened to the people? But in his letters home, Bruno never mentioned his hospital visits. In fact, he avoided talking about anything that he was actually feeling. Well, these are copies of letters that my father sent to my mother almost daily during his trip to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima is surprising in many ways, a sort of Bristol of Japan, We live in the perpetual dusk of the town. We are the envy of all because we live in a building whose roof does not leak. There were enough moments of breathtaking scenery to make up for many discomforts. I think what held my attention was a kind of awful silence. That I want to sort of scream at these letters, tell me something about what you're really feeling. Bruno was 37 years old. Science had given his life a direction. Now it had won the war, but he remained uncharacteristically silent. It's what's not there that gives me a chill in my stomach and makes me need to find out how my father ever got beyond the unspeakable. The war had been very helpful to Bruno's career. When he came back from Japan, his improved prospects gave my parents the confidence to take on their first home. We're in Monk's Risborough, which is where I lived from the age of almost 2 to the age of 6, and so far I don't recognise a single thing, which I suppose is not really surprising. But I do know it was on a road, I mean a main road, so, oh, look. Oh my goodness. The thing I do remember is this scale. I mean, this is a tiny cottage, and it was rental, and it had a cold water tap. But when my mother talks about Fir Cottage, it's a palace. It was a palace for her. It was her first home, on her own, with her family. They'd always shared before then. After the war, Bruno left military employment, but he didn't return to his maths lectureship at the University of Hull. Instead, he continued his successful career in applied science in public service. He worked for UNESCO and then in the British coal industry, where he oversaw the development of a new smokeless fuel. The so-called Bronowski briquettes never made it into general production. But by that time, my father had a flourishing television career. Bruno started broadcasting on the radio in 1946. That July, the US conducted the first post-war atomic bomb test. In its coverage of this event, BBC Radio invited Dr. Bronowski to speak as an expert witness who'd seen the effect of nuclear weapons. A year earlier, in Japan, he'd been lost for words. Now, Bruno spoke out.
In Nagasaki, the atomic bomb burst above and between the 2 huge armament works in the northern valley of the city. The slum of wooden houses and workshops between these works was wiped out instantly. But the steel skeletons of the long factory sheds which made up these works remain, leaning crazily out from the explosion as if they had been pushed sideways by a giant hand.
Only sections of a recording survive, and for the first time I read my father's script in full. The very first thing that takes my attention, it deploys a vocabulary which is really not at all the vocabulary of a documentary account of an act of warfare. He announces from the very beginning of this, from the very first paragraph, that this is a piece of evocative writing, that this is emotionally freighted.
A giant fist has punched in the upper stories of the concrete buildings and has crumpled a gasometer like a tin. Derelict machines, wires, steam piping and girders festoon the cold furnaces.
The language of this broadcast reminds me of the modernist poetry that I know my father admired.
What the momentary heat did to human beings near the center of damage may be judged from a photograph on which you see a granite step roughened by the heat flash, except where an unfortunate man sitting on the stone has screened it and has preserved its polish at the cost of his life.
And it launched him on first his radio and then his television career. However, the emotional power that marked Bruno's 1946 broadcast soon became part of a more entertaining personality as a good-natured public intellectual. The Brains Trust was a popular show in which four highbrows sat in a studio and answered questions sent in by the audience.
A very special welcome back, Dr. J. Bronowski.
Bruno was a regular panellist.
Parnell Kerr, or Carr, whichever he prefers, of Ewell, Surrey, writes, "Why are modern composers so afraid of a tune?" We had a lot like that. Then Mr. Roger Wood of Birmingham asks why no other composer gives him such complete enjoyment as Bach.
A work of art is a living thing. The man made it, but he only took it so far. Then the man who renders it, the composer, the speaker, the man who hangs the picture, adds something. But in the end, the work of art lives in you.
Yes.
You're the person who has to listen to it. I can only say this constantly to people who talk to me about modern art or modern music. You know, it's you who've got to create it in the end. Yes. If you give it its full value, you will get its full value out of it.
But Bruno was emphatically not just an entertainer. He had something important to say.
Politician, scientist, poet.
After the war, revulsion at the inhumanity of the atomic bomb produced a public distrust of science.
A large number of people tend to feel that the scientist stands, as it were, outside moral issues, feels that he's in a neutral position.
You know, I think the scientist as a bogeyman is pretty dead.
Yes.
Don't you?
Despite all he had seen and done during the war, Bruno was now on a personal crusade to explain why people ought to trust scientists.
You know, we've only been living on this planet a comparatively short time. You know, how old is man? Oh, 30 million years. By this time, we're very unlikely to have many of the answers right. And what a great scientist does is to approach the world with questions.
Meanwhile, Bruno's career in applied science advanced. In the 1960s, my parents moved to Southern California as Bruno became associate director of the New Salk Institute there. Founded by Jonas Salk, the biologist who invented the polio vaccine, these laboratories were a clarion call for a scientific future. At the Salk, I listened to a radio broadcast my father made at this time.
I'm distressed to see how many people today are afraid of the future and of science together. I believe that these fears are mistaken.
I've come to meet a scientist colleague of my father's here at the Salk Institute. Mel Cohn, too, went to Japan in 1945, not as a scientist, but as a young medic in the American Army.
I mean, just picture yourself walking into a city that doesn't exist anymore. Footprints that are burned into the ground. The person who was standing there evaporated. It's the kind of thing that is obviously very touching and very emotionally affecting.
After returning from Japan, Mel Cohn enjoyed a brilliant career as a biologist. He, too, never lost faith in science. I wonder if Mel's story can help me understand my father. I'm trying to work out how my father retrieved his optimism, his absolutely dogged sense that science was the key to the future.
He was a rational human being.
But what about you? What about you?
You have to remember that both Bruno and I are of a very special generation. The Great Depression, a war that involved the world and was probably the most destructive, far beyond any atomic bomb. And we were part of that generation. We survived it and we suffered through that, so that in order to deal with the world, a certain amount of optimism was necessary.
Mel Cohn has given me an arresting insight. Bruno was a survivor too. As a young man, science had helped him make sense of the world and given him confidence in his own abilities. It continued to do so even after he'd witnessed the dreadful destructive power of the atomic bomb. In 1960, Bruno wrote and presented Insight, a television series exploring in a personal way key scientific ideas. This is my earliest memory of my father on TV.
We live in a time when things express their function and meaning by their shape. Here's a ship's propeller. The fact that it pushes the water aside is expressed as clearly in its shape as in any words that I can speak.
When Insight was broadcast, I was a scholarship girl at Cheltenham Ladies' College, which had a good reputation for science. Just like my father, I specialised in maths. Returning to my old school and watching my father here reminds me how strong his influence on me was. When people ask me what it was like to grow up in a house, in a home, with Jacob Bronowski, I always say, and always have said, it is absolutely the same as it is for you watching him on television. So I am his little case study of what he really wanted for the whole of the next generation. By the 60s, I had 3 younger sisters, Judith, Nicole, and Claire. These photos give a real sense of the Bronowski household. Our father taught each of us in turn to play chess. The man behind the camera was a close family friend who was also a professional photographer, David Farrell. He and his wife Manning recall how Bruno was at home. What I'm trying to do is to have a conversation with him, which is of course absurd because he died when I was 30. In fact, I've lived more of my life without him than I ever lived with him. And the way to have that conversation, of course, is to have it with the people who knew him and perhaps understood him. And that's really how I come to be speaking to the two of you.
Well, that's right. And when I came with the camera, I always felt this closeness that Bruno had with his girls.
This is a picture of my father with Nicole, my third sister, and Claire, the youngest one.
He loved playing games with
Yeah, there's he's playing Go with Nicole and Claire. Look at Claire's face.
Yes. And chess.
And
There's a
chess.
picture
Yes,
there.
this is Go again.
Yes.
Here's the chess. Here we are.
Now, what I think is so lovely is that he made you think. That was the thing. Deeply, nothing superficial. And that he was imparting his knowledge, through you. Somehow, that he expected and he wanted you to be well-informed and successful in your life.
I loved living up to my father's expectations, but it eventually caught up with me. I followed Bruno to read maths at the University of Cambridge. Halfway through my degree, I realised I just wasn't good enough to become an academic mathematician. My confidence was absolutely rocked. Coming back to Cambridge, reminds me what an important moment that was. And it was a huge, huge crisis for me. I feared I was disappointing my father. It was a very important moment in our life together, as it were, and I confessed to him, and I said to him I couldn't go on. Bruno was totally supportive. He suggested that I quit maths and change to English literature. I did so and got a good degree. Then, like him, I stayed on at Cambridge to do a PhD. When I got my doctorate, my PhD, in 1974, my father sent me from America, where they were then living, his doctoral gown. And it came with a letter I still have, saying how wonderful it was that I was following in his footsteps. Bruno died in 1974, not long afterwards. All these years later, I can see that my relationship with my father was warm, even intense, but very much on his terms. I was his dutiful daughter. Having glimpsed Bruno's personal crisis while he was in Japan in 1945, I now wonder if I had missed something in what he was saying. The obvious place to look is in The Ascent of Man, which was my father's last word on mankind and science. Here, even nuclear physics is celebrated as one of the great triumphs of the 20th century.
At twilight on the 6th day of creation, so say the Hebrew commentators to the Old Testament, God made for man a number of tools that give him also the gift of creation. If the commentators were alive today, they would write, God made the neutron. Here it is, the blue glow that is the trace of neutrons, the visible finger of God touching Adam, not with breath, but with power.
I replay a selection from The Ascent of Man in a viewing theatre. The title of episode 11 is Knowledge or Certainty, and it's about the limits of scientific understanding. I first saw it at the screening the BBC organised to launch the series. I was there because my father was recovering from a first heart attack and was determined this should be kept out of the public eye. It is in this programme that Bruno deals with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In his concluding statement about the bomb, Bruno quoted a physicist who worked on it, his close friend, Leo Szilard.
I had not been long back from Hiroshima when I heard someone say, in Szillard's presence, that it was the tragedy of scientists that their discoveries were used for destruction. Szilard replied, as he, more than anyone else, had the right to reply, that it was not the tragedy of scientists, it is the tragedy of mankind.
Then the film cuts immediately to Auschwitz and the machinery of mass murder. Here Bruno made a speech that seems passionately to contradict the overall thrust of the Ascent of Man series. He warns that science gives humanity awesome powers, and it is essential that mankind does not misuse them.
It's said that science will dehumanize people and turn them into numbers. That's false, tragically false. Look for yourself. This is the concentration camp and crematorium at Auschwitz. This is where people were turned into numbers. Into this pond were flushed the ashes of some 4 million people. And that was not done by gas. It was done by arrogance. It was done by dogma. It was done by ignorance. When people believe that they have absolute knowledge with no test in reality, this is how they behave. This is what men do when they aspire to the knowledge of gods. Science is a very human form of knowledge. Science is a tribute to what we can know, although we are fallible. In the end, the words were said by Oliver Cromwell. I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken. I owe it as a scientist to my friend Leo Szilard. I owe it as a human being to the many members of my family who died here, to stand here as a survivor and a witness. We have to cure ourselves of the itch for absolute knowledge and power. We have to close the distance between the push-button order and the human act. We have to touch.
That bit is completely unbearable to me. He bends to grab the mud from the pond, except that it isn't mud, it's human ash. That, however many, 3 minutes, is a miracle of capturing somebody's inner angst, Jacob Bronowski's inner angst. I feel sure that if I can connect Bruno's anguish at Auschwitz with his wartime research, in which science was used to kill people, I will reach a deeper understanding of my father's complicated attitude towards science. And that is why I'm back where the mystery began, in California. I'm in Los Angeles to visit a Hollywood film director, Mick Jackson. I've discovered that he began his career at the BBC and was behind the camera when Bruno was in front of it at Auschwitz.
I'd recognise that knock anyway.
Mick, hi. So Mick, I've come to see you because you actually filmed The Ascent of Man with my father. Could you tell me a bit about what the whole process was like? Was it a big team effort, or did he lead it? Did he drive it?
His ideas drove it and drove us.
Were you awed by him at all?
Of course, everybody was awed by him. The whole crew was awed by him. We loved him. We called him Prof.
Let's talk about the program that I really have to tell you I profoundly admire that you actually made in The Ascent of Man, in which my father is in Auschwitz and the program ends with a slow motion sequence of his lifting ash.
Human ashes.
Human ashes.
Out of a pond.
Did he balk at all at going?
He didn't want to go. He was very uneasy about going, and I can understand why. It hadn't been tidied up, didn't have kind of wheelchair access and guide rails. You walked in and you saw these mountains of shoes and suitcases and false teeth and spectacles and things. And then you saw the gas ovens. I mean, it's rusty, but probably still serviceable, the crematoria. And this pond at the back in which, for want of somewhere else better, they had flushed the ashes from the crematorium. You couldn't help but be affected by it. And I know the day that we wanted to film, Bruno walked alone around it and saw the same things that I had. But he had to be aware of the fact that he had this reputation of being the man who always had something to say. And he says that that's when the quote from Oliver Cromwell came into his head.
I beseech you in the bowels.
I beseech you, and the way he says, in the bowels of Christ, makes me cry every time I see it. And I was there, and it's 30 years ago.
Think it possible that you are maybe mistaken. Do you know what? It feels like a message in a bottle to me.
Yeah, that sense was with us all.
I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken.
I wonder if Mick can help me understand how Auschwitz and the dropping of the atomic bomb were connected in Bruno's mind.
Do you think it's possible that at Nagasaki and at Hiroshima, he had an emotional epiphany, a sense of remorse that wasn't just about dropping the bomb, but retroactively about the work he'd done on strategic bombing? It's impossible to deny part of your knowledge of the world when you're confronted by the physical evidence.
This is going to sound ridiculous, but remorse is the word that I haven't been finding for that Japan trip.
But do you think the remorse is in the Auschwitz scene? He doesn't refer to the bombing explicitly, I think, in that piece, but it seemed to all of us present that that was a genuine expression of remorse, not just for Auschwitz, but for the part of the human psyche that could conceive of doing such things. You cannot but believe that they are linked in his head. You actually take the evidence of the burnt tissues and you use that as the kind of evidence for the emotional state that you should be in, the ethical state that you should be in as a result of these actions.
My father's personal decision after the Second World War was to move on. He chose to shield me, his daughter, from any remorse he might have felt. But it seems that at the end of his life he was reconsidering, revisiting emotions he had buried for so long. I regret I never took this chance to speak about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I wish I could talk to Bruno now about how he was formed by those wartime experiences, what they meant to him. Fortunately, someone else did, on television.
When in fact did you first become aware of this extraordinary mental capacity that you have?
It's one of those wife-beating questions.
As part of the launch campaign for The Ascent of Man, Bruno was interviewed by Michael Parkinson. Because Bruno died shortly after this, I've never been able to bring myself to watch the show. This is the first time I've watched it through.
What happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the work of men like yourself. And it comes into this area, doesn't it, of moral responsibility. I mean, are scientists really interested in human beings? Or is it just ideas that they're bothered about?
One is faced at many moments in one's life between loyalties which are not compatible. One is faced with a question of loyalty to one's country as against loyalty to one's religion. And during the war, many scientists were faced with a very simple and brutal question, which is, do I feel about the civilization in which I work strongly enough to do anything to resist the Nazi threat to make a bomb first? And we all felt yes about that.
Now, I happen to know that at the end of this Parkinson recording, he collapsed backstage. And I can watch, because he was my dad, as in that sequence, the intensity of feeling is really damaging. He has a heart condition. It's really damaging.
I mean, that's what morality is about. That's what being a human being is about. You are faced with questions of value to which there are no numerical answers. Never think that you can write down an equation which, at the end of which, you say in a satisfactory tone of voice, that's fine, I have now proved loyalty to my country is more important than loyalty to the scientific tradition. No, that's always got to be a personal choice.
Well, let me put
My father takes off his glasses and cleans his glasses in public. That is a danger signal in my father, that he is extremely distressed.
And he said,
it's striking to me that what triggered Bruno's distress was recalling the moral dilemmas faced by scientists during the war.
Now, if it was applied...
I realise he never lost sight of his past. That was why he demanded a scrupulous morality from the scientific community. because The Ascent of Man came so shortly before his death, and because the big sweep of The Ascent of Man is so affirmative and so bold, that was what I had in my head as what my father believed about science and progress. But what I found, and found on film, I mean, it's not hidden, it's in plain sight, is his questioning and urgent imploring, really, of the scientific community to live up to the standards that he is proposing for them. I'm now the same age my father was when he made The Ascent of Man, and have to face knotty ethical dilemmas in science myself. Since 2008, I've been chair of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, which regulates the sensitive area of assisted human reproduction. Through IVF, science brings hope to thousands of childless couples, but to some, it is tampering with nature. Absolute faith in science doesn't help there. Nor when it comes to deciding whether to grant a license for research that may save lives, but involves experiments on human embryonic material. I turned detective on my father, fearing he wasn't the man of integrity I thought he was. Then I discovered how he transformed his remorse for the calamities of the 20th century into hope for the future. I understand now that his optimism was born out of a deep conviction in the rational capacities of humanity. And knowing my father now for all that he was, I can once again confidently make him my role model.
My life has been happy. Because although I have suffered many conflicts of loyalty, which I spoke to earlier, I've never had any uncertainty about the meaning of the word good, the meaning of the word true, the meaning of the word beautiful. I've always had a tremendous pride in being a human being and being born in the 20th century. I'm terribly sad that, 30 years from now I shall be dead, because not because anybody will miss me, but because I will miss them. Because so many more marvelous things will be known. Now, should you listen to me? Yes. Yes, you should. Not because you have to believe any single thing that I say, but because you have to be pleased that there are people who have led happy and complete lives, who feel that they can speak out of a full heart and a full mind, all in the same breath.
A few months later, in August 1974, Bruno died.